They saw the uniform and assumed they knew everything about him. Another middle-aged guy flipping burgers for minimum wage, probably a dropout, probably going nowhere. The customers barely looked at him when they ordered. The teenagers working alongside him called him Pops, and the manager treated him like he was lucky to have the job. What none of them knew was that the man behind the register had once coordinated airstrikes in Afghanistan. Welcome to Stories of Secret Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden valor and unexpected courage, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who never stopped serving others. The job posting at Jimmy's Burgers had been up for 3 weeks. Day shift, minimum wage, must be able to work weekends. Most applicants took one look at the grease-stained floors and the chaotic lunch rush and decided they had better options. Then, Bob Martinez walked in. He was 48, with salt and pepper hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. His handshake was firm, his posture straight, and when manager Dave Collins asked about his work history, Bob simply said he'd done government work and was looking for something steady. Dave hired him on the spot, not because Bob was qualified. Anyone could learn to work a fryer, but because he was the only applicant who didn't seem desperate or apologetic about applying for a fast food job. Bob started the following Monday. He wore the regulation uniform without complaint, brown polyester pants, yellow polo shirt with the Jimmy's logo, and a paper hat that made everyone look ridiculous. He learned the register quickly, memorized the menu in 2 days, and never once asked when he'd get a raise. The other workers noticed him immediately, but not in a good way. "Yo, Pops," called out Marcus, a 19-year-old who thought he was management material after 6 months on the job. "You going to be able to keep up during lunch rush?" Bob just nodded. "I'll do my best." Ashley, a college sophomore working part-time, whispered to her friend loud enough for Bob to hear. "I feel bad for him. Imagine being that old and still flipping burgers." Bob pretended not to notice. The customers were worse. They'd walk up to the counter, eyes already scanning their phones, and bark orders without making eye contact. When Bob asked for clarification or suggested add-ons like he'd been trained to do, they'd sigh with impatience. "Just give me a number 2, no pickles, and make it fast. Can I interest you in—" "I said make it fast." Bob would nod politely, ring up the order, and move on to the next customer. No complaints, no attitude, just steady professionalism that everyone mistook for resignation. Dave Collins, the manager, felt almost guilty about how little he paid Bob. The guy worked harder than employees half his age, never called in sick, and handled difficult customers without ever losing his temper. But Dave also assumed Bob was probably just grateful to have any job at his age. What none of them saw was how Bob worked, not the speed. He wasn't the fastest on the line, not the friendliness. He was polite but quiet. They didn't notice the way he positioned himself to see all the entrances, how his eyes tracked every customer who walked in, how he seemed to catalog details without appearing to pay attention. Bob Martinez saw everything. He knew that Mrs. Patterson came in every Tuesday for a senior coffee and had started shaking slightly in her left hand. He'd noticed that the teenage kid who ordered the same combo meal every day after school had bruises on his wrists that he tried to hide with long sleeves. He'd observed that the businessman who came in every morning was growing increasingly agitated and paranoid, checking over his shoulder constantly. Bob saw it all, but he didn't say anything. That wasn't his job anymore. Until the morning, everything changed. It was a Thursday in November. The breakfast rush was winding down, leaving just a few regulars and the usual collection of coffee drinkers who used Jimmy's as a temporary office. Bob was behind the register, cleaning the counter while Ashley restocked napkins, and Marcus pretended to look busy by moving French fry containers around. That's when he walked in. The man was in his early 20s, thin, with the kind of nervous energy that came from too many stimulants and not enough sleep. He wore a hooded sweatshirt despite the mild weather, and his hands stayed buried in the front pocket. Bob's attention sharpened immediately. It wasn't just the obvious signs, the way the man's eyes darted around the restaurant, how he avoided the security camera near the door, the fact that he was sweating despite the cool morning air. It was something deeper, something Bob recognized from places where young men learned that desperation could make anyone dangerous. The man approached the counter, his movement jerky and unpredictable. "Welcome to Jimmy's," Bob said, his voice calm and steady. "What can I get for you today?" The man stared at him for a moment, his pupils dilated, his breathing shallow. I need all the money in the register." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Marcus dropped the fry container he'd been holding. Ashley froze with a stack of napkins halfway to the dispenser. The few customers in the dining area looked up from their phones, not yet understanding what was happening. Bob didn't move. "I'm sorry, son. Could you repeat that?" The man pulled his right hand from his pocket, revealing a small black pistol that shook in his grip. "I said give me all the money, now." That's when everything changed. Bob Martinez, the middle-aged fast food worker who everyone assumed was a failure, who teenagers called Pops, who customers treated like furniture, stepped directly into the line of fire. "Easy now," Bob said, his voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to fill the entire restaurant. "Let's talk about this." The gunman's eyes widened. He'd expected screaming, panic, immediate compliance. Instead, he was facing a man who looked at him with the kind of steady attention usually reserved for something interesting but not particularly threatening. Don't try to be a hero, old man," the gunman stammered. "Just give me the money and nobody gets hurt." Bob nodded slowly. "I understand you need something, but before we do anything we can't take back, help me understand what's really going on here." What happened next would be replayed on security cameras and retold in news reports, but the people who witnessed it would never forget the way Bob Martinez transformed before their eyes. He didn't tackle the gunman. He didn't make any sudden movements. He simply did what he'd been trained to do 15 years earlier in a different uniform, on a different continent, when de-escalating dangerous situations was his specialty. Bob's voice remained steady, but now it carried the unmistakable tone of command. "Son, I can see you're scared. That's okay. We're going to work through this together." The gunman blinked, confused by the response. "I'm not scared. I just need the money." "I believe you," Bob said, "and I want to help. But first I need you to point that weapon toward the floor. Not at me, not at these kids. Just down. Can you do that for me?" Something in Bob's tone, not condescending, not aggressive, just absolutely certain, made the gunman hesitate. The gun wavered. "That's good," Bob continued. "Now, what's your name?" What? Your name. I'm Bob. What should I call you?" The young man's face crumpled slightly. Tyler. Okay. Tyler, I've been where you are right now. Different circumstances, but that same feeling like you're out of options. Like, this is the only way forward. Behind the counter, Marcus and Ashley stood frozen, watching Bob work with the kind of quiet competence they'd never seen before. The customers had backed away, but nobody had run. Something about Bob's presence made the situation feel controlled, managed. "Tyler," Bob continued, taking a small step forward, "I'm going to guess this isn't really about the money. Am I right?" Tyler's hand shook harder. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't. But I know that look. I've seen it on a lot of young men who thought they were trapped. Most of them weren't as trapped as they believed." For 10 minutes, Bob Martinez stood in that fast food restaurant and did what he'd once done in forward operating bases across Afghanistan. He talked a desperate young man back from the edge, not with force, not with tricks, but with the kind of patient professionalism that comes from understanding that violence is usually just fear wearing a disguise. When Tyler finally lowered the gun, Bob stepped forward and gently took it from his hands. When the police arrived, they found Tyler sitting in a booth, crying, while Bob sat across from him with 2 cups of coffee, listening to a story about student loans, addiction, and a family that had stopped returning phone calls. It wasn't until Officer Patricia Santos arrived that anyone thought to ask the obvious question: how did a fast food worker manage to disarm a gunman without anyone getting hurt? The answer came when Santos, a veteran herself, watched Bob interact with the responding officers. She noticed his posture, his communication style, the way he briefed them on the situation with military precision. She pulled him aside after Tyler was led away in handcuffs. "What unit?" she asked quietly. Bob looked at her for a long moment. 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours Afghanistan. Rank? Staff Sergeant? What were you doing over there? Bob smiled for the first time that day. "Talking people out of bad decisions mostly." Officer Santos nodded. "How long you been out? 4 years? And you've been working here?" Bob shrugged. "Someone's got to make the burgers." Word spread through Jimmy's Burgers like wildfire. Not the official story. That would come later, sanitized for corporate consumption. The real story, passed from employee to employee, customer to customer, like electricity through water. Bob Martinez wasn't just a fast food worker. He was a decorated combat veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. The man they'd been dismissing had walked through some of the most dangerous places on earth, and he'd chosen to spend his civilian life making minimum wage and taking orders from teenagers. The transformation was immediate. Marcus, who'd called him Pops for 18 months, approached Bob's register the next morning with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry." Bob looked up from counting the register, the same calm expression he'd always worn. "For what, Marcus?" For not seeing." Bob straightened up, all 5'10" of him, and Marcus suddenly understood that the man he'd been condescending to was probably tougher than anyone he'd ever met. "Marcus, you know what I see when I look at you?" Bob asked. The young man shook his head. "I see someone who shows up every day, works hard, and treats customers with respect. That's all I've ever seen." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "Now help me get ready for the breakfast rush. Mrs. Patterson will be here in 20 minutes for her senior coffee, and she likes it fresh." The change wasn't just internal. Customers who had barely acknowledged Bob's existence began making eye contact when they ordered. They said please and thank you. They asked how his day was going. Ashley, the college student who'd felt sorry for him, started asking Bob about his military experience during slow periods. Not invasive questions, just genuine curiosity about someone she'd completely misjudged. Dave Collins, the manager who'd thought he was doing Bob a favor by hiring him, began to understand that some employees bring more to a job than what appears on their resume. "Bob," Dave said one afternoon, "I want you to know that if you ever want to move into management—" Bob smiled. "I appreciate that, Dave, but I'm good where I am." "You sure? You could probably run your own franchise." Bob considered this. "I spent 15 years giving orders and making decisions that affected other people's lives. These days, I kind of like just making sure people get their burgers the way they ordered them." Dave nodded, though he didn't entirely understand. A month after the incident, a local news station ran a story. "Local fast food worker prevents armed robbery using military training." The piece was brief, professional, and focused on Tyler's rehabilitation rather than sensationalizing the drama. Bob declined to be interviewed on camera. "I did what anyone would do," he told the reporter. "Tyler needed help, not headlines." But the story had an impact. Other veterans in the area began stopping by Jimmy's, not for the food, but to meet the staff sergeant who'd chosen to serve hamburgers instead of seeking glory. They'd order coffee, sit in the corner booth, and nod respectfully when Bob walked by. Some would linger after closing time, when Bob was cleaning the fryers and restocking for the next day. They'd talk quietly about the challenges of civilian life, about finding purpose after service, about the difficulty of explaining military experience to people who'd never worn a uniform. Bob listened to all of them with the same patient attention he'd given Tyler, the same calm presence he brought to everything he did. One evening, a young veteran named Rodriguez, recently discharged and struggling to find work, asked the question they all wondered about. "Sarge, why here? Why this job? You could probably do anything." Bob finished wiping down the counter before answering. "Rodriguez, what's the most important thing we learned in the Rangers? Mission first? Before that?" Rodriguez thought for a moment. "Take care of your people." "That's right. Take care of your people." Bob gestured toward the dining room, now empty except for the two of them. "Every day people come in here hungry, tired, stressed about work or school or family. I make sure they get fed, get treated with respect, get a few minutes where someone cares about doing their job right." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "It's not glamorous. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work that serves people who need serving. That's enough for me." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "You think there's a place for me here?" Bob smiled. "Dave's been looking for someone reliable for the evening shift. You interested in learning how to make a proper burger?" 6 months later, Jimmy's Burgers had become something unique in the fast food industry, a place where veterans found not just jobs but purpose. Bob never advertised this, never made it official policy. It just happened, the way good things often do when someone with quiet leadership creates space for others to flourish. Tyler, the young man who'd walked in with a gun, was released after serving 6 months in a rehabilitation program. His first stop wasn't home, wasn't to see friends. He came to Jimmy's Burgers. Bob was behind the register when Tyler walked in, nervous but determined. The lunch rush was in full swing, but Bob somehow found time to step away from the line. "Tyler," he said, extending his hand, "good to see you. Mr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you and to apologize." Bob shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology. How are you doing?" "Better. I'm clean. Got a job at a warehouse starting community college in the fall." "That's outstanding. I'm proud of you." Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life that day, not just by stopping me from doing something stupid, by treating me like I was worth saving." Bob nodded. "Everyone's worth saving, Tyler. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us. As Tyler left, Marcus, who'd been listening from behind the fryer, walked over to Bob. "That's the guy from that day, isn't it?" "That's him." "And you're not mad? Not scared?" Bob considered the question. "Marcus, I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when people give up on each other. I've also seen what happens when they don't." He gestured toward the door where Tyler had just exited. That kid didn't need punishment. He needed hope. Sometimes the best way to serve people is to see them for who they could be, not just who they are in their worst moment. Bob Martinez never got a promotion, never asked for one. He clocked in every morning at 6, tied his apron, and started the fryers. He took orders from people who still sometimes treated him like furniture, though now many of them knew better. He was still the same quiet man who methodically worked the breakfast rush, who remembered regular customers' orders, who never complained about the grease stains or the minimum wage. But now when students rushed past him during their lunch break, some paused to say thank you. When business executives barked orders, some caught themselves and tried again with more courtesy. When young veterans struggling with civilian life needed someone who understood, they knew where to find him. Bob Martinez had served his country in uniform, walking through some of the most dangerous places on earth. Now he served his community in a paper hat, making sure that anyone who walked through those doors got more than just fast food. They got treated with dignity by someone who'd learned that real strength doesn't need recognition and true service doesn't require applause. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Bob Martinez? Someone who served without seeking glory, who chose humble work over prestigious positions, who saw dignity in every job worth doing well? Share their name in the comments. Tell us their story. Because here at Stories of Secret Heroes, we believe the greatest heroes often wear the most ordinary uniforms. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that honor comes in many forms. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, the person making your coffee, scanning your groceries, or taking your order might be someone who once saved lives in places you'll never see. Stories of Secret Heroes, where everyday courage gets the recognition it deserves.